school year was in its final hours when the Russian ice-class vessel, the academic Sergei Vavilov, under the command of Captain Kalashnikov, headed down the Beagle Channel and into the storm-tossed waters of the South Atlantic. Ahead lay the Falklands, the first in a group of increasingly remote islands we planned to visit around the fringes of Antarctica. New Island is one of the Falklands group, where a crowded nesting site is home to a mix of rockhopper penguins, king shags, and beautiful black-browed albatrosses. The black-browed variety can live for 30 years and mates for life. Mating pairs reinforce their relationship by much billing and cooing. On the island of Steeple Jason, just a few miles away, the rocky shoreline was alive with black-browed albatrosses. 85% of the world's population make the Falklands their home, and this outlying island has more than 200,000 breeding pairs. In fast deteriorating weather, the ship sounded the emergency signal for all ashore to return at once to the landing site. The trip back to the ship was a wild, exhilarating ride. The great birds, with their 8-foot wingspan, whirled and wheeled about our heads as the roller coaster Zodiacs leapt and bucked in the waves, drenching us with spray. Recovery of the Zodiacs proved to be quite a challenge, and one of the boats capsized, tossing its crew into the chilly waters. Fortunately, they were the last but one Zodiac to be retrieved, and they were rescued by the crew from the remaining boat. Not surprisingly, they are looking a little shaken after their dunking. Our next destination, South Georgia, lay 800 miles northeast of the Falklands. Like all the islands we visited, other than East Falkland, it was only accessible by sea and hid itself from our anxious gaze as we made our landfall. Slowly the veils of mist parted to reveal first the gleam of a glacier and then a glimpse of towering snow-capped peaks. The island is 100 miles long, 20 miles wide, and more than 50% of it is covered by glaciers. South Georgia was a major center for whaling in the early 20th century, and as we shall see, the remains of several whaling stations still litter the island. Grisfin is the point of entry manned by a small garrison of British Marines. It was established as a whaling station in 1904 and was the first to be built on South Georgia. The church was dismantled from a small town in Norway and reassembled here in time for Christmas 1913. But Grisfin is a place steeped in the stench of gigantic death. During its 60 years of operation, more than 54,000 whales were butchered on its flensing plan, including 9,000 of the huge and endangered blues seen in this 1914 photograph. But the whalers have long since departed these shores, and the bows of the catcher Petrel will never again lift to the ocean swells, and her harpoon gun will never again fire its deadly missiles into living flesh. The whalers' cemetery holds the remains of many who died. The most famous person to be buried here is Ernest Shackleton. A cross in his memory stands on Hope Point, and a granite headstone, shipped from England, marks his final resting place. I was ever a fighter, so one fight more, the best and the last. The verses read over his grave were the very same as those that he had himself read over a gravesite for 3 of his men at Cape Evans on Ross Island just 5 years earlier. Shackleton was only 48 years old when he died in 1922. It was time for us to move on down the coast to Fortuna Bay for our introduction to king penguins, as well as to fur and elephant seals. After the emperors, kings are the second largest of the 17 varieties of penguins, and they move in stately fashion in their elegant attire. We continued westwards along the north coast to Elsahol Bay, at the extreme western tip of the island. There is something mesmerizing about the view through the bridge windows. Maybe it is the rolling movement of the ship, or the constant motion of the ocean, but even seamen with a lifetime of experience stare stolidly ahead for hours at a time. Despite its beauty, or perhaps because of it, the rugged coastline of South Georgia is studded with jagged rocks that call for careful navigation. After Elsahol, we turned back east, still keeping to the northern side of the island, which is much less exposed than the southern shore. We stopped first at the abandoned whaling station of Leith. Anyone for tea? Rotting curtains still line the windows. Next to collapsed building and abandoned boats are the remains of the Flensing Plan, up which whales were dragged to be dismembered, in their thousands. But it was not only the whales who left their bones in this place, and not everybody who came here returned home. Those who came were not simply intent on killing whales, and by 1812 fur seals were virtually wiped out in South Georgia. In 1916 only one single male was sighted on the island, which, as you might expect, was promptly killed. At the end of the 1950s, the world population of fur seals was estimated at only 5,000. But by the year 2000 it had risen to 4 million, and South Georgia is now home to 95% of the world's population. This photo of Stromness was taken in 1914. Here is the manager's house to which Shackleton made his way after his epic boat journey from Elephant Island. The plaque reads, "On the 20th of May 1918, Sir Ernest Shackleton arrived here, accompanied by Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, after an epic trek of 30 miles from King Haakon Bay. There they left 3 comrades with a tiny boat, James Caird. In her they had sailed 800 miles from Elephant Island for help, after their ship, Endurance, had been crushed in the ice in the Weddell Sea. This was their first contact with the outside world for 17 months." These are original photographs of the James Caird being launched at Elephant Island. The painting of the landfall in South Georgia and of the actual boat itself were filmed in 2003 at Dulwich College in London. The last part of the trek involved descending a frozen waterfall. Here is that waterfall, not frozen, but tumbling down the hillside. Ice falls from one of the surrounding glaciers, triggered by the summer temperatures, were a reminder not to become too complacent. The main inhabitants of this wondrous place were the kings, who, in this little group, clearly demonstrate that even for penguins, 2's company and 3's a crowd. Then there's the Monty Python School of Funny Walks, although I'm sure there must be a good reason behind this behavior. These fuzzy balls of chocolate fur are king chicks in their toddler suits. Kings breed twice in 3 years. When the chicks are bigger, they are left on their own while both parents forage, and in the winter they may have to wait as long as 3 months between feeds. They may be scruffy during the molt, but they can only be described as magnificent when complete. The crisply defined patterns, combined with the subtlest shading of colour, all formed from the combination of thousands of individual feathers, is a further example of the miracle of nature. We continued east along an increasingly rugged coast. Our last anchoring spot was off Cooper Bay, which was the home of yet another species of penguin. These were the feisty macaroni. These are the most numerous of all penguins, and their world population is estimated at 9 million. Their name originates from that strange little rhyme. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his hair and called it macaroni. The macaronis nest in crowded, noisy colonies tucked among the tussock grass. Like other penguins, the young are fed with regurgitated seafood by their parents. On the return to the ship, the Zodiacs threaded their way through a maze of rocks, heavily populated with a noisy mix of macaronis and other seabirds. Leaving South Georgia in our wake, we were headed now for bleaker and more remote islands, with names like Deception and the historic Elephant Island. In fact, we were crossing the very same stretch of ocean that Shackleton crossed in the tiny James Caird 61 years earlier, although we were to encounter many more icebergs. Every one of the white spots on this radar screen represents a sizable iceberg, and the ship's track took us right through the middle of them, with berg after berg stretching beyond the horizon. Finally, Elephant Island itself came into view, and Nomon Island marked the location where Shackleton's men spent 4 anxious months, not knowing whether the James Caird had survived the journey to South Georgia and rescue was at hand, or whether they would be marooned forever in this hostile place. They were finally rescued on August the 30th, 1916. It was deemed too rough for us to make a landing, and we sailed away from Elephant Island without setting foot on its shore. Our first actual landing in the Antarctic was at Coronation Island in the South Orkneys. This bleak place is a rookery for Adelie penguins, which breed further south than any other penguin. Bright patches of slow-growing lichen provided the only splashes of colour in this black and white landscape. The fuzzy charcoal chicks huddle together in large groups for protection against the ever-present skuas, which circle overhead and patrol the rookeries on the lookout for any hint of weakness. These birds are smart and relentless predators. It was also time for us to return to the water, and the Zodiacs toured the ice floes en route back to the ship. Many of the flows had originated from the interior of ancient glaciers, which explained their color of breathtaking blue. Here at Hannah Point on Livingston Island in the South Shetland group, we were introduced to the aptly named chinstrap penguins, who reared 2 chicks per breeding season. Like all penguins, chinstraps face the same daily laborious trek down to the sea. Gentoos also share this site in large numbers. The going can be treacherous over the rocks. Oops. Apparently no harm done. These are tough little birds. Gentoo nests consist of a few sticks and stones, which they routinely steal from one another. There seems to be some indecision going on here. Gentoos also bring up 2 chicks. As always, the skewers are continually probing for any sign of weakness. Here is an example of a single skewer applying bullying tactics to a group of young gentoos. Those that fail to measure up fall easy prey to the marauders. Large numbers of elephant seals also inhabit this place. At this time of year their skin resembles peeling wallpaper, and they wallow in noisy, smelly, bad-tempered groups, waiting out the itchy molt before they can return to the sea. Penguins have no fear of humans and exhibit great curiosity. If you keep still, some will invariably come to check you out. We came next to Deception Island in the South Shetlands. This ring-shaped island is aptly named because it is a semi-active volcano in which the caldera has been flooded through a breach in the rim called Neptune's Bellows, which is 700 yards wide and obstructed by submerged Raven rock. The approaches are marked by a series of bizarre sea stacks. A low point in the rim is called Neptune's Window. Once through the entrance, the caldera opens up into a well-protected natural harbour. At one time, 13 factory ships were based here, but the whalers were driven out by economics in 1931. The Vavilov is anchored in Whalers Bay, a sheltered anchorage within the already protected harbour. Deception is an eerie place. Steam arising from the volcanic sand shrouds the walkers on their way to Neptune's Window. Rusting oil tanks and boilers are all that remains of equipment used to process the whales. Decaying boats, along with the bones of the whalers' victims, lie buried in the black sand. Dilapidated buildings and rusting equipment litter the landscape. Streams of water suddenly appear from nowhere, and even the pattern of melting snow on the surrounding heights appropriately resembles a fire-breathing dragon. The caldera is large enough for an ocean-going ship to penetrate for 6 miles. A massive Black Streak Glacier, its surface carpeted with cinders, is stark evidence of a titanic conflict between fire and ice, which occurred barely 30 years ago. The Zodiacs are launched for a second landing in the caldera, this time to allow those wishing to do so to take hot baths on the chilly beach. Remains of scientific bases littered the barren slopes. They were destroyed and their staff driven out by a volcanic eruption in 1970. A cemetery lies buried 30 feet below the cinder surface. The water is hot enough to scald if care is not taken. Skirting the sheer cliffs, we made our way back out through the narrow gap. Here is Neptune's window just coming into view, followed by a scene looking down from the top of the rim. The sun was setting as we left this strange island. Dawn's rosy fingers were stealing across the sky when we reached the Antarctic Sound. The gathering light bathed the icebergs and surrounding peaks in a gentle glow as the sun crept slowly above the horizon. We came to Rosamel Island, and icebergs sailed serenely through the channel, propelled by strong currents. The height you see here is only 1/8 of the total, with the remaining 7/8 hidden beneath the water. Crab-eater seals spend their entire lives out on the ice. Old ice is an electric blue, reaching an intense violet in the deepest holes. From the Antarctic Sound we headed south to Paradise Bay. Often shrouded in fog, it was clear on the day of our visit, and it was indeed paradise.
We're at position latitude 64 degrees 50 feet south, longitude 62 degrees 54 west. The outside air temperature is 4 degrees Celsius or 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The winds are light and the sea is calm. We should be arriving at our anchorage in just a few minutes.
We landed at the Argentinian Almirante Brown base, barely visible against the backdrop of the towering mountains. One of the most famous channels in the Antarctic Peninsula is the Lemaire Channel, named after a Dutch seaman who was the first to sail around Cape Horn. On a clear day, Humphreys Heights guarding its northern entrance are a spectacular sight. In mid-January, the Sergei Vavilov was the first ship of the season to transit the channel, which was obscured by mist and choked by ice. A British survey vessel appeared ghost-like through the gloom. We were reminded of those lines from the poem The Ancient Mariner. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold, and ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men nor beasts we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around, it cracked and growled and roared and howled, like noises in a swound. We anchored at the southern end of the channel and went ashore on Peterson Island. The natives were extremely friendly, and this cute Gentoo calmly walked up the other side of the rock I was leaning against, acknowledged my presence, and went ahead with his grooming. A striking natural ice sculpture forms a backdrop for these adelies on their way to the sea. A barbecue was held on the aft deck, which the falling snow turned into a magical evening. Both young and old participated in the dancing. The evening was further enlightened by a dance exhibition between a Russian immigrant with artificial legs and an 80-year-old lady. The sea was showing signs of freezing as we headed towards our last landing at another Argentinian base at Waterboat Point. The base was lonely and insignificant among the icebergs and falling snow. Keep in mind that this is high summer. Penguins porpoised through the water as we took our leave of Antarctica and headed north across the Drake Passage towards the infamous Cape Horn. Finally, Cape Horn itself came into view. It is not in fact located on mainland South America, but on Horn Island, named after a small town in Holland. The Cape is notorious for its terrible weather, and waves as high as 110 feet have been recorded. It could take square riggers as long as 3 months to battle their way around it. One example is the Cambronne, which took 92 days to round Cape Horn in 1905, less than 100 years ago. Albatrosses love these waters, and on Cape Horn there is a moving memorial to all the sailors who have lost their lives in this area. The original poem at the memorial is in Spanish, but the English translation reads, "I am the albatross that waits for you at the end of the earth. I am the forgotten soul of the dead sailors who crossed Cape Horn from all the seas of the world. But they did not die in the furious waves. Today they fly on my wings to eternity, in the last trough of the Antarctic winds." As we entered the Beagle Channel, our amazing journey was drawing to its close. We were welcomed into Ushuaia by a display of brilliant rainbows, but we had already found our pot of gold.